need like a whiteboard or anything?
I think I'm okay.
Okay, cool. Take it away, guys.
Are we good, Kai? All
Can
right.
you see both of us? So it's a bit weird with one.
You want us to stand here?
That's okay.
Okay.
All right. Okay. Cool.
I'll sit down with you. So, thanks everybody for giving me and Nick the floor. I'm going to give a really quick history of the EIP process. Back in 2015, Martin Beasy created a repository for EIPs that was meant for him figuring out some of the problems around decision making that were happening. He wasn't big on being an editor. From what he's talked to me about before, he's like did it because there wasn't really anything else there at the time. It was a complete copy of the BIP process, the Bitcoin Improvement Proposal process, which is itself a copy of the PIP, Python Improvement Proposal process. That is a mouthful. So, anyways, the EIPs were pretty unstructured for a while. They had issues and PRs, and there was no means of finalizing anything or getting consensus around things unless they were implemented in a hard fork, pretty much, even though there were multiple tracks for EIPs. So in late 2016, early 2017, I redid EIP1, which was the EIP that defines the structure of the EIP repository. After that, we brought on some new editors, including Casey Detrio, Vitalik, I think, is still technically an editor on there, Greg Colvin, Nick Savers is an editor, a few other people. And we also have some other new developments recently that Nick will go over in a second. But basically, the purpose of the EIPs is to codify and formalize proposals that improve the protocol, either at a low-level core protocol layer or at a higher layer, such as community-run standards. So like ERC20 tokens is a community-decided standard that was finalized as an EIP. Those are also called ERCs sometimes. So that's kind of an overview of the EIP repository. We're still in the process of making some changes that Nick will talk about now, and some stuff we've recently done.
So what I've been trying to do recently is trying to streamline things and change a bit the way we treat drafts and finished EIPs, because historically it's been quite unclear to editors what the bar is for merging a draft, what the bar is for moving it to the next stage, and so on. And what I've been pushing for and setting up automation for is to say we exercise effectively no editorial control over drafts. If you want to write a draft EIP, you can write a draft EIP. It has to be syntactically correct. It has to have the right headers that specify the metadata we need in order to categorize it in there. It needs to have an identifiable author, somewhere you can go to discuss it, and so on. Beyond that, the only requirement really is that it's not obviously crazy and that it actually makes some kind of sense. So if you try and submit a contract standard to amend the Ethereum chain, we're going to say no, it needs to be one or the other, But beyond that, the goal is anything that meets some very basic criteria should be merged pretty much as quickly as possible. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is we don't want the perception that we exercise some editorial control over what can be proposed as a change to Ethereum. We want to keep it sort of neutral in that regard. And the other is that if things get mired in pull requests forever, then that becomes a sort of a de facto discussion forum for that. And then when it does get merged, the discussion kind of gets broken up and split up between different venues and PRs and so on. And that actually discourages editors from merging it, which is perverse because it makes it harder to get a permanent identifier. And that's, I guess, the third reason really, is that we want some sort of permanent URI people can point to and say, here is draft 503 or whatever. And so with that in mind, I've automated a bunch of stuff. It still takes an EIP editor approval to get a draft merged, but once it is, any of the editors on the draft can submit PRs that modify it, and a bot will automatically merge those because they own the draft. What's still a little vaguer in some areas is how things progress past draft. So here's my view of how things function, which may line up fairly well, but maybe not entirely with other editors, which is that we have two basic processes. We have core EIPs, which amend how the chain function. functions. For something like that, the process goes: you write and submit a draft. When you think the draft is mature, you ask for it to be added to the All Core Devs agenda, and it gets discussed there, probably with you dial in and you pitch why you think it's a good idea, and once that is is discussed at Core Devs, they decide either they will implement it, so the client representatives say yes, we're happy to code this into our client, in which case it gets moved to accepted, or they decide yes but not now, in which case it gets moved to deferred, or they decide no, in which case it remains as a draft, or at your option you can withdraw it, or they say go edit it and make some changes and come back later. And in that sense, the EIP editors are doing purely clerical duty in representing what the current state of consensus around it is. They're not setting the consensus, they're just reporting on it. The second process is the ERCs, and that's a little bit less well defined, but basically goes: write a draft, get some people to implement it, stabilize it, and when you think it's sufficiently stable and useful and widely adopted, then say, I'd like to move this to final. And then you have like a last call. Anyone can object on the PR to move it to final, saying, no, I don't believe this is mature, no, I believe there are still significant issues that will cause problems, because once it's final, it's not being changed. And then if there's no objections, it gets merged and your EIP is moved to final. The thing I'm trying to emphasize in this process is that the EIP editors are trying to reflect consensus, not form it, and not act as like a governing body more as much as they are the clerks of the court.
Yeah, pretty much his description of how things go, I agree with, except to say that right now there are some bottlenecks in the process. The editors are a big bottleneck in the sense that there's so many EIPs out there and such a backlog that we can't always be monitoring all of them, so we don't know when things are implemented and final. So that really puts a lot of the stress on the edit or the EIP writers to prove to us that it's actually being used and usable. So that's the only other thing I'd comment there. So with that, if you have any other comments?
And for them to communicate clearly when they want something merged, especially if it's a legacy PR that existed before the sea change.
Yeah, exactly. So I was going to move on to the core developer calls. So they happen every 2 weeks on Friday at 1400 UTC. So afternoon in Berlin, morning in most parts of the US. And what the goal of the core developer meeting is to get the low-level protocol developers of Ethereum. So that means people who implement Ethereum clients, people who do research on low-level Ethereum main chain topics, sometimes layer 2 stuff, but mostly main chain stuff, and other people who contribute to EIPs or thought discussion around this stuff to join in on a call so that we can discuss current issues if there are any questions, or there needs to be collaboration or voice communication between the clients to make sure that they're all working together, and to decide on things that are going into the next hard forks and next protocol upgrades for Ethereum. So that's what the intent of the core devs call is. What that's turned into, though, because there's this void within figuring out what to do with ERCs and with some of the more community standards, they've been pushed into the core dev call, which I'm hoping, over the next few days as we're talking, and also just in general through online discourse, we move into a different format for discussing ERCs and things that the core developers either don't want to have a say in or only want to implement when they know that there's community consensus. In general, the core developers are very heads down. They're not very political. They're not very apt to, really express strong opinions about a lot of things. And that's been the way core developers have been all the way since the DAO and before the DAO, where they really wanted to kind of just stay out of it. For those of you who were back then, there wasn't a lot of people who were really raging hardcore in one direction or another. They just wanted to implement what the community wanted, and they wanted to code. They just want to code. So basically, the history of the core developer meeting is that back in 2015, 2016, George Hallam, who used to be the community director for the Ethereum Foundation, as well as a number of other roles, ran this meeting that was basically just mostly the Ethereum Foundation, because back then this was before Parity and before a number of other groups split up and made other clients. There was just the Java client, C++, and Go, and Python. So they would just have the core developers, maybe 8 to 10 people in a meeting, get on, not recorded, just notes taken, and discuss hard forks, compatibility issues, things like that. They weren't really timed. They'd happen every once in a while, maybe a month in between, depending on if a meeting, or maybe even as needed, was kind of the how it happened. Once George left the Ethereum Foundation in late 2016, I took over the role of doing the core developer call and morphed it into something that was more on schedule and had a little bit more depth to it. So since then, I've been working on kind of adapting it so that it can be wide-reaching so people can understand what decisions are made there. As part of that, there's a repository called PM for project management in the Ethereum GitHub, and it has notes, very detailed notes with links back to the live YouTube videos that I record of the call that go over everything on the agenda, the decisions that were made, the things that were tabled, etc. And lately, Lane has been helping tremendously on that. He's been writing the notes for the last few core dev meetings, and he facilitated the last core dev meeting because I was on a vacation. So ever since the beginning of 2017, the calls have been recorded, at least audio, but mostly audio and video of the calls, and that went from having 10 to 12 people on the call to now upwards of 30 and 40 people on the call at once. I don't know if we've hit 40 yet, but we're getting up there definitely. So Nick is usually on the calls, and I kind of want to hear your perspective on the calls and like what you think, like what I said was pretty accurate and how you feel they affect the ecosystem.
Yeah, I think that pretty much covers, I think that's a pretty good description, and I think you're right that most developers, when it comes to political questions, are mostly like, what do the users want, let's implement that. When it comes to technical questions, they can be quite vociferous.
Yep.
And that's really what most of them are there for, to be honest. Is like, what's this cool new feature? Is it worth implementing? Is it enough? Is there enough use of it to make it worthwhile, and so on?
Yeah. So that's basically it. Those are the two ways we have governance today. I mentioned the ERCs don't really have a place right now, but I actually need to correct myself. The Fellowship of Ethereum Magicians is a group that was trying to fill in the gap of being the kind of IETF technical enforcer, more or less, of the EIPs and some of the Ethereum governance processes. So they have a web form where if you have an EIP, you're welcome to start a discussion thread on there. I know EIP 999 had a pretty active one. And in general, compared to GitHub and Reddit threads, the Ethereum Wizards threads are a lot more like calm and collected and a lot civilized is the best word for it. So it's not a bunch of trolls, so things get done a lot more quickly. So we're moving away from having a GitHub issue every time we have an EIP, or especially an ERC, and moving it to having it on like your own repository, or having it on the Ethereum Magicians forum or something else like that. So I think that's a good direction. I also hope that we come up with other avenues for people to discuss these type of improvements they want on the ecosystem in a way that doesn't get dogged down by too many trolls. And that's pretty much covers it. I think that's all we really wanted to talk about as far as the overviews go.
Do we have time for a couple of questions?
Oh yeah, does anyone have questions? I'll just do a couple of those.
Let's take 5 minutes for questions.
How does someone become an EIP editor?
Oh yeah. So how does someone become an EIP editor? You basically, so it's not really a fabulous job at all to do that, and no one really wants to. Honestly, I've asked people. So if you really think, so you have to kind of understand Ethereum and understand people at the same time. So if you feel like you can do that, please talk to us, because if you have at least some experience in the community and feel like you can take on that task, we're pretty open, right?
If you say, like, I'm really enthusiastic about improving the automation of the whole process, then you'll have a PR to add you to the list before you've finished your sentence, probably.
Yeah, so that's how people become editors. The people who are editors right now are those who kind of organically came together back in 2017 when we reorganized to kind of help out with this.
I had a question. and I'm sure people here have their own opinions, but I'm curious if your opinions, you're close to it. What are the things that are broken in the current process that you'd like improvements, within especially in the short term, simple, stupid things?
So the question was, what improvements would we like, especially in the short term, to improve things within the current process? Nick, you want to go first?
Anything.
Put you on the spot there.
Yeah. Anything contentious is a problem because it's so if it's an ERC, then it's unclear when it should be finalised by the editors because it feels like now we're exercising editorial discretion. If it's in a core EIP, then it seems unclear when all core devs should decide on something. So it comes back to how do you judge community consensus? So in general, clarifying what the criteria are for accepting changes in either part of the process is the biggest thing.
There's probabilistic finality instead of deterministic.
A probabilistic finality versus deterministic?
No, I meant in the process.
Oh, in the process, yeah.
Pretty much.
Yeah, I kind of echo what Nick says, and just to say that if there's other processes that can intertwine with the core dev call and with the EIPs that can kind of complement them and help them, especially figure out some of the hard decisions, like you were saying, the contentious issues and knowing when to finalize things. I think the more clear, non-trolly voices that come out in support of things are going to help us decide when to finalize stuff quicker.
Actually, I guess the other thing is making discussion more coherent and finding the right place for discussion. So we've moved from everybody just discusses stuff on PRs and issues by default to explicitly asking each EIP author to nominate this is the URL where you discuss stuff, but it still doesn't seem ideal. It seems like we need to make that a little more coherent, and I'm not sure how that would happen.
So who gets to decide whether an EIP is an improvement and should be implemented in the first place? It depends on the EIP. If it's a core EIP, which is protocol level, low level stuff that changes the main chain, that's decided in the core developer call. Normally it's basically if you implement it in your client, and if you have 2 to 3 clients implementing it, because we have about 5 to 6 clients right now that are fully compatible and passing test. If 2 or 3 start implementing it and everyone else follows, that's how that's decided. For ERCs, community-based EIPs, those are decided more from people implementing them and people championing them within their organization. So ERC 721 is a good example. That exploded. Everyone has the non-fungible asset within their DApp now. And we could see clearly, that's an example of a clear example of like, oh, this should be finalized. Whereas something else like there's all these token standards floating around, and some of them are more well written in my opinion than others, but until they're implemented, it's hard for us to view, like implemented and used, it's hard for us to view what's should be the right one to finalize.
There are actually very few ERCs that have made it to final and aren't just drafts because it's a bit unclear what the exact threshold is, but definitely adoption in multiple clients and stability of the standard are criteria, but not like, do we think this is a good idea? We kind of hope that if it's a bad idea, people won't implement it and won't deploy it widely.
So is it the editors who decide whether it goes from draft to...
In the case of ERCs, yes. In the case of EIPs, that's the all core devs.
Yep.
Question from Michael H. What kind of issues does Ethereum governance face in regards to establishing community consensus that the Fellowship of Ethereum Magicians has identified?
The Fellowship of Ethereum Magicians says what?
Yeah, has identified. So
I think he thinks that's us.
More of a general question of like, how does the Fellowship of Ethereum Magicians have legitimacy, or?
Oh, how does the Fellowship of Ethereum Magicians have legitimacy in the process, and how do they complement us, maybe?
Yeah.
I think maybe he thought we're the Fellowship of Ethereum Magicians based on that wording.
Yeah, but either way, they complement us in a way that they can. I guess their function hasn't fully formed yet, and I wish there was someone here. They weren't able. The main people involved in it weren't able to attend, unfortunately. But I think their role is still evolving, and I think that Right now, their forum is used to discuss ERCs and the EIPs, and they're talking about being more involved in the governance process, about setting up ways to have discourse over the technical merit. They really want to focus on the technical merit, I should say, not on if something should happen, but more, is it technically sound, and is it a good idea technically?
So there is now like a subsect that is coming out that's deciding like, oh, we're interested in talking about philosophy. So I feel like that was a conversation that came out of the magicians. It was like, it was technical and it's still, but then there might be another group that splits off.
Okay.
That might be this group. We don't figure that out.
Yeah, so Ashley just commented that at the Ethereum Magicians meeting that happened in Berlin?
Paris.
In Paris, they were talking about how there's a, that they're still going to be very focused on technical, but there's a branch forming that's more philosophical in nature.
And it should be noted that it is open to anybody, and one should feel that it's...
Oh yeah, all this is open. Oh, how do things get on the core dev meeting agenda? You go to the agenda page that's in the PM repository and put a thing down. I've had people from the community like join the call before who have no experience coding clients. Some of them aren't even that technical. They're more economic based, like ideas around what they want to do, like some issuance reduction stuff, and they've been on the call before. So it's really not an exclusive club by any means as far as input goes. If you have some smart commentary or something that you want to propose to be on the agenda, I mean, we're structured to only be an hour and a half, so I might have to cut some stuff out, but in general, you can always add stuff to the agenda. Just wanted to throw that out there.
That's it for time that we have. Thank you guys for that really great overview. I've got notes here. If anyone else has notes, maybe snap a picture and upload it to the Telegram, or you can email it to me. But we'll also collect notes at the end of the day.
Thanks, guys. That was awesome.
So yeah, thank you.